Hello everyone, I'm Lucas,
And I'm Lisa.
and welcome to the second episode of the Centerville, Iowa Memories podcast. And today, we'll be diving into the mystery about why the southern part of Centerville along 18th Street is called the Levee. There is no river or body of water there. But before we tell you the answer to the question, we need to explore that area of South Centerville and how it developed. So, Lisa, can you tell us just a little bit about how South Centerville got its start?
Sure. Actually, I'm going to take you back a little farther than when it got its start. Back when the Indians left. Back in 1843 was the dates. I'm not sure what date of the year, but in 1843 the Indians moved out of Iowa and Appanoose County was formed. And then about 3 years later, Centerville, the town of Centerville, was platted. It was pretty much just the square, and it started out as Chaldea. And then by 1855, that's about 9 years later, Centerville was incorporated. And at that point in time, they changed the name to Centerville. So I'm going to give you a little side story here. So the town of Centerville was actually named after a congressman from Tennessee that was well respected, whose last name was Center, spelled with an S. And they filled out the paperwork, sent it up to the state to incorporate the city of Centerville with an S. And the people at the state apparently thought that the people in Centerville didn't know any better, and so they changed the spelling and put a C on the front. So it is named Centerville because of that mistake, but that is who Centerville is named after. And so anyway, and also that same year, Cincinnati was platted. I don't know that when it was incorporated, but it was platted that year. So there's another point south of Centerville. And then things are growing along here for the next few years. And then in 1868, the first mine in Centerville went in, where the Golden Age Manor is today, and it was the Watson mine. And so now there's a little more activity south of Centerville. So you're getting a pathway that's building up that's going from Centerville to the Watson mine, Cincinnati, and on to Missouri. So there were a lot of people traveling that corridor. But then in 1871, there were two railroads that came through south of Centerville. The first one is what eventually became the Rock Island Depot, and it sat approximately where the Ideal Ready Mix elevator sits today. It's a large area of ground where there were some stockyards and a turntable and the depot. And the other one was what eventually became the CB&Q Depot. It sat across the street from the depot that we know today. So those are the two railroads and the two depots that cropped up in the south part of Centerville. And then in 1875, just a little bit later, maintenance buildings for the railroad and the roundhouse were added close to where the South Edge Arena ended up being. It's kind of the east side of 21st Street, similar area with the water tower in that area.
So all of these railroads were pretty far south of town at that point. So why were they so far south? I guess it seems like it'd be kind of an inconvenience to everyone.
You know, that's kind of an interesting story. The city fathers had signed the contracts to bring the railroads to Centerville in 1871. And the expectation was that the railroads would be like a half a mile south of town, not too far from the square, but convenient, but not right on the square. And so the city fathers signed this contract, and at the time they didn't realize the contract said a half a mile south of the corporation line, meaning a half a mile south of the city limits. And by that point in time, 1871, the city limits were a half a mile south of the square, about, if you're going south, probably about where Drake Hall, is located. That's about a half a mile from the square. And so this contract pushed the railroads another half a mile, so a full mile. And it said a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile, so it may even be a little bit farther. And so that's how it ended up being so far from the square.
So with the railroads being so far south of town, is that kind of how that area started developing on its own, almost like its own little town?
Yeah, it did start developing on its own. Mainly, one of the fellows that worked for the railroad, he saw the great need for a hotel in that area for the railroad workers. And then, of course, he had the coal miners down in that area. And the hotels were so busy and so popular that another 4 or 5 opened up in that area during that time. And they were all very busy. And then there were small businesses that were cropping up to, sell dry goods or mining supplies or groceries, because there were people living in the neighborhoods down there then, or creating neighborhoods at that point in time. And it was also, that area was on the road to Cincinnati and on to Missouri, and so there were getting to be a lot of need for different services in that area, and so it did kind of crop up and develop on its own.
So it sounds like that area south of Centerville was developing rather quickly. So about when did that area become known as the Levee?
Well, I'm going to preface this a little bit with the story about liquor in South Centerville. Liquor was not allowed in the city limits, and these hotels near the railroads, they were outside the city limits, and so they started serving liquor. And that drew people from the city to come down, and then you've got your railroad workers, and you've got the coal miners, and it became kind of a wild area with a lot of drinking, gambling, not much for laws outside. Apparently, within city limits are where laws applied, and beyond the city limits, they didn't too much. So you've got this area of South Centerville that is pretty wild and crazy, and there's a man that moved here from Keokuk to take a job with a local tailor. His name was George Armour, and he was not averse to throwing back a drink in the evening, and he would travel down what was called then Missouri Street. It's 18th Street now, and he would go to these hotels where they served alcohol, and it was really unruly and considered wide open, sort of anything goes down there. And George Armour had been to an area very similar to this, where he came from in Keokuk. And in Keokuk, that wild area was called the Levee. And I'm assuming it's because it was near the Mississippi River. And so he started calling South Centerville the Levee because it reminded him so much of Keokuk's Levee. And not because of the way it looked, but because of the way the people acted. And so then the railroad men and the coal miners that frequented the liquor joints that had talked with George Armour, they started calling it the Levee. And the name has stuck. The first occurrence I found in the newspaper was in 1899. And so, but that name has stuck, passed on through generations, reinforced by advertising, newspapers, customers, all calling it the Levee. But the connotation, the Levee, to us is just a location. But back then, it was a derogatory term, meaning a wild, unruly place. And so there's your answer to the question.
Well, now we know why that area is called the Levee. I'm still a little curious, I guess, on how people would have gotten from the depots to the town of Centerville if it was that far south of the town.
Well, these people are getting off the trains, and they're down there in, if it was a scary, wild area, I'm sure they were wanting to get out of there pretty fast and get up to the town. But if they didn't have a connection here with horses or, horse and buggy is how most people would have gotten there. But these other folks, they had to walk through there was still a lot of wilderness and fence, but there were fence rows once they reached a neighborhood, maybe, I don't know that there were any sidewalks, but there were probably some dirt streets that they walked along. And so, it wouldn't have been easy. In about 1884, they did install a mule car trolley, which was planks along I don't know if it was in the middle of the street or its own separate road, but they put planks down for the mules that were pulling these trolleys, and then people could travel straight. It went from the depot to the square. And eventually they had electrified trolley lines. I'm not sure if they were exactly the same path, but the trolleys would go from the depots and to the square, and I can tell you the path that they took. So they're at the depot and they go north, kind of where to the Eagles, I think that's Walsh Street, and then it turned west, and then it went west across like around Garfield School, and then to the north and turned west again on Sheridan, and then in front of the Alliant Building until they got to Drake Avenue, where it went north all the way to what we know as the Craver Building on Maple, and then it went west on Main Street, 1 block, and then onto the square. Well, maybe that's 2 blocks, but that's okay. And then onto the square. And I think that is still probably a commonly used path if you're going from the Levee area to the square. That's kind of the shortcut to get there. So we've developed some pathways that kind of got us from the Levee to the square and back. But if we go back to the 1800s, that 1871 to 1880 were kind of the wildest times. But then in 1880, the Centerville City Fathers were kind of watching how booming the Levee was. And they were a little afraid that Centerville was going to dwindle and that the Levee would become the more popular place to go. And so they quickly moved to move the city limits down farther south. I'm sure that went at least to the depots. I'm not sure exactly how far they went, but it did incorporate what we commonly know as the Levee to capitalize on that booming business. And with that, and all those liquor joints were still down there, and so putting them inside the city limits forced them out. So it forced them, and they just moved south. So wherever the city limits were, they just got a little farther south and farther south to escape that. Of course, eventually the laws changed where there were bars inside the city limits. So I haven't ever looked that up to know what year that was, but if you'll notice, over the course of our lifetimes, a lot of the bars were south of town, farther south of town, like the Club 34 and the Spur, and it just seemed like that's the area where those things cropped up. But they had the opportunity to stay where they were if the hotels, of course, they just would stop selling liquor, or they became a blind tiger, what they called in the newspaper a blind tiger. And those were places that say they didn't sell liquor, but people could go there and buy liquor under the table.
So it really sounds like there was a lot of business and foot traffic going on in the area. I even understand they had their own post office at one point.
Yeah, that's right. There was, if you recall, Walsh Street is down there. It was named after Edward Walsh, who had a store down there, and it also, from 1880s to early 1900s, had a post office in there. You will find Walsh on railroad service maps during that era.
So it sounds like a lot of other businesses really started to take off. Can you tell us a little bit about what businesses kind of cropped up in that area?
Sure. Of course, we started with all those hotels and the depots. And so then naturally, Restaurants cropped up. They had to have some hardware stores. There was even a bank. It was almost its own town, but not. It never really was its own town. And of course, it's part of the city of Centerville at that point. The east side of that street, where the Eagles Club to where Centerville Produce is, was a major business hub. It had 22 buildings in that one block. And the west side of the street had the bank and a produce house and a barber shop and several other businesses there. The Rosenbaum grocery store existed for 75 years or so. There were many businesses that came and went. That area catered to immigrants mostly because they lived in that area of South Centerville.
So with all of these new immigrants coming into the area, when did actual neighborhoods start developing?
So as the railroads came to town and there were lots of jobs there and the coal mining really picked up in Appanoose County, there were different segments of neighborhoods that were similar immigrants. Of course, there's an area that we still call Swedetown. It was full of Swedish immigrants and railroad workers and then coal miners, and I think some of them owned stores. And there were Italian immigrants and other European immigrants that started building up South Centerville kind of in the 1880s through the 1920s. Several of them came for coal mining, but others were shop owners. And then around that time, there were also industries cropping up in South Centerville. And so there were industrial workers among those immigrants.
So it sounds like industry kind of took off around then. What kind of industries did come to Centerville at that point?
Well, before that point, industries were smaller, but larger industries, they really needed the use of the rail lines. And so being down in the South Centerville where all of the rail lines, they could build alongside the rail lines, it was really important. One of the biggest industries that started very early in the 1900s was Hercules manufacturing, and they were making stump pullers for people to use to clear their land. They would cut down, we're talking like trees everywhere, and so they had to clear land to use it for crops or whatever. And so the stump pullers were popular all over the world, and they were made here in Centerville. That later became Fuller Manufacturing. And then there were other foundries that cropped up. There's the Martin Foundry, there was Judy Manufacturing, among others. And then there was a poultry processing plant, Swift and Company. Of course, these are businesses that cropped up along the rail line, but they weren't necessarily on the levee. But this is kind of an illustration of how South Centerville was growing. But on the levee, there were the McKee Button Factory came in, and that was not super early. That wasn't around 1900. It was a little later than that. They had 3 different buildings. The one the Eagles is in, and then when the laundromat is in, and then the next building south of the laundromat were all McKee Button Factory buildings. And then there was the Great Western Tire and Rubber Company building, which later was owned by Pillsbury. And then there was the Baxter Box Company. And there were lots of other businesses that have come and gone over the years. And to this day, the south part of Centerville is still our industrial area.
So it sounds like that area south of Centerville is almost like its own little town. Did it even have its own school district and churches?
Well, yeah, the Swedish folks in Swedetown, they had their own church. It's still standing. It's what became the Evangelical Covenant Church there west of Convenience Corner. There was also a school in South Centerville, the McKinley School. There was a time frame where there was just all sorts of kids and they just didn't have enough places to send them. So they built the McKinley School. And then, of course, part of South Centerville extended beyond the city limits, and so that was taken care of by a country school. I think it's called the 30 School, that was located sort of out in the area where Orchlands is, maybe a little closer to town than that. And then, of course, Garfield School would have taken care of a lot of the kids in South Centerville. And then the immigrants were oftentimes Catholic. And so the Catholic Church is toward South Centerville.
So, with all of the businesses and schools that popped up around the Levee, it was a really busy area for quite a long time. So, about how long did the Levee businesses flourish?
I think the Levee looks like it was the busiest from the 1890s to maybe the 1940s, as coal mining and railroads were peaking in the area. But just for fun, I went through a lot of the city directories there at the museum, and I can give you kind of a rundown of some of the businesses that were located there each decade. So, of course, we already talked about 1870 to 1880 with the railroads and hotels. And then 1880 to 1890, the biggest thing was that it was included inside the city limits, forcing alcohol sales farther south. And the mule cars came along. And then the name of the Levee had already become common and being used in newspaper articles in 1897. Then from 1890 to 1900, tensions seemed to grow between Centerville and Levee people. The Levee people felt they were being considered as second-class citizens. But the name continued, and in 1899, the Levee had its own baseball team. Of course, during that time, there were a lot of blind tigers with the liquor sales under the table, a lot of drinking and fighting. It was a very busy business district. There were barbers, a bathhouse, jewelry store, billiards, bowling, which I really like to find out more about that, bowling alley, a couple of druggists, dry goods, 2 grocery stores, 5 hotels, and several restaurants. And then from 1910 to 1920, that's when the new CB&Q depot was built. And there were, at that point, lots of remodeling and new buildings built. A lot of those first buildings were wood frame, and so they were being replaced in some cases with brick buildings. They had an indoor baseball league, and they had a team for that. And the Levee moniker started showing up in advertisements. Some of the businesses would call themselves at the Levee. And very booming businesses in that era. There were 10 grocery stores in the, okay, this is 4 blocks starting at where the Eagles is now, going south. There were 10 grocery stores and 2 bakeries and 6 restaurants. Candies, druggists, barbers, all those same things. And then there was, where the laundromat is now, was a company called Lago Marcino Group Company. It was a wholesale fruit company that provided produce to the local grocery stores. And then there were lots of other kinds of variety stores. A problem they were having at that point in time was vagrancy and drunkenness near the depots and the railroad maintenance buildings. And there were 5 murders in between 1915 and 1920. Then between 1920 and 1930, it was very busy with new brick buildings replacing wood frame buildings. Along the Levee, there were pool halls and tailors and butcher shops, and the Saddle Rock Cafe opened during that time. I remember it in the 60s or 70s, so that one lasted a long time. There were several restaurants and barbers, and the Lago Marcino Group Company was still there. And then there were beginning to be gas stations cropping up because of need for gas. And then between 1930 and 40, of course, the Depression hit. And so the Southside Savings Bank closed in January of 1930. Times are tougher for all the business owners. The 1938 directory listed 11 buildings as vacant. But there were still bakeries and groceries and gas stations, still some restaurants. And they did have a baseball team then even, and they were at that point called the Levee Rats. So another sadly derogatory term. But then during the 40s, that's when things kind of took a turn. Coal mining was slowing down, and some immigrants moved away from the area to Rockford, Illinois, and other places for work. And in 1946, the Rock Island Depot moved to its new depot south of town near the airport. But the CB&Q is still there on the levee. In the 40s, the McKee Button Factory was there, the Meta Cheese Factory offices. There were still restaurants and gas stations. And the farther south and east you went, there were more industries and an implement dealership. And then during the 50s, there were still several businesses, most of the ones that I've already mentioned. The South End Drugstore, and I think it was there for a long time before the 50s. It might not have been called South End Drug. I think maybe it was Swank's Drug before that. And there were groceries and barber shops and lots of other little businesses. But then the railroads were slowing down, and the last passenger train on the CB&Q boarded in March of 1958. And so during the 60s, there was some progress. Centerville Produce moved to the levee, and Johnson Furniture moved to the levee, but a big fire took out the South End Drug, leaving a gaping space in that once solid block of businesses, and the hole is still there today. And the Eagles Club had moved into one of the McKee Button Factory locations. Plumbing, woodworking, bakery. The Saddle Rock was still there. Rosenbaum's was still there. And then there were Zephyr Cleaners and Centerville Produce, and the A&W Drive-In was down there. Johnson Furniture, Centerville Body, and there were several other grocery stores. And the levee since that time, the A&W had closed, Saddle Rock is closed, and the levee was just so dependent on those railroads and the coal miners and the industries. And the loss of the South End Drug did a number on it. And I don't think it's ever really gotten back to the booming times of the early 1900s, but it's still a business area, but nothing like it was in the first part of the 1900s. But there are a lot of positive things down on the levee right now. The Historic Preservation has done a great job with the historic depot. Centerville Produce has a fine new facility. The Eagles are a busy and active group with their club. And there are lots of other businesses down there. It's just not the same kind of place that it was in the 1900s. And one thing that we know now for sure is that the levee no longer is separate from Centerville. People that live in and frequent the levee are not considered second class at all, and Centerville just really stretches far beyond that anyway. So back in those days it might have been two separate areas, but now we're all one big community.
All right, well, I think that kind of wraps up today's episode. I want to thank you, Lisa, for getting all of this information gathered and presenting it to us today. And look forward to next month's episode where we dive into some of the more notorious criminals of Appanoose County.